Hello, good evening. I guess it's evening now in Argentina. It's broad daylight here, and I want to first of all start by apologizing for not being able to make it to the conference, the FAPI conference this year. You must have been informed that the postal services in the UK lost my passport, and so it was not possible for me to make it to the conference, the FAPI conference, which is really sad. Anyway, thanks to the OUP team here in the UK and also in Buenos Aires, it's been possible, at least for me, to be part of the conference through a means that scares me to death through technology. And I hope that my presentation will make some sense to you and will kind of help you reflect on some of the things that you already know and maybe revisit some of the ideas that you are probably aware of. So my session is about teaching young learners and teenagers. And I'm trying to look at where we are in relation to what's happening with colleagues in contexts that are different from ours, but also where we are, especially where we are in relation to the students, these young people that we have the responsibility of teaching. So broadly speaking, I'll be looking at four main areas. I'll start by exploring an educational context, the one from where I'm coming, and also look at very briefly, my research experience, and then share some examples of classroom experiences on things that working together in partnership with students has helped teachers, myself and other colleagues achieve in the kind of context in which most of my work, my teaching and research has been based. And then I'll conclude with some final thoughts. Maybe I should point out that the outline looks very structured, but indeed my presentation is going to be dealing with all of these at the same time. So do not expect me to follow a very ordered structure as it appears in the outline. Having said that, I come from a country called Cameroon, which you probably know of in Argentina because of the World Cup in 1990. But it's a country that's made up of about 25 million people. It's known to be a bilingual country in English and French because of the colonial connections that we had with France and Great Britain. But more importantly, this is a country in which 286 local languages are spoken. Some are dialects, many are in fact languages. And so people might not understand each other, even when they are called francophones. So those from the French-speaking part of the country will not understand each other if they're speaking their local languages. And that would be the same for those from the English-speaking part. Within this country, bilingualism in French and in English has been seen as a very important thing to promote, given that politicians think that national unity depends entirely on having people expressing themselves in these two languages, which our founding fathers of the country thought were neutral languages. But if you're following history, if you're following news now, you probably have discovered that at the moment. However, most of my experience within this context has been teaching English to children from French-speaking parts of the country in French medium schools. And I worked not just as a teacher, but also as a teacher trainer, and eventually became a policymaker for bilingual education, looking after the curriculum, but also pedagogy practices for English in French medium schools and also for French in English medium schools. Now, broadly speaking, the methodological recommendations in my context are based around some of the things that are familiar to you and used in many other parts of the world, helping learners to develop communicative competence and Teachers are required to engage in learner-centered and in some cases learning-centered pedagogic practices, encourage participatory approaches, learner engagement, use of eclectic methods, and to develop problem-solving skills and abilities such as thinking activities, real-life use of language, etc., etc. And the focus of teaching is mostly in this context and in other contexts, has mostly traditionally concerned itself with these teaching methods. So the curriculum recommends these teaching methods, and teacher education, in-service teacher training focuses on helping teachers to develop different teaching methods and techniques, to reflect on teaching theories, and sometimes we're looking at the best materials. We have concerned ourselves with looking at what curriculum, what kind of syllabus design, what classroom conditions, and what technology would be most suitable in helping us develop communicative competence in our learners. But come to think of it, aren't we missing a point here? Most teacher education, especially in my context and other places, parts of sub-Saharan Africa I've worked in, do not always have such a strong focus on learners as they have on teaching techniques, on technology, on methods, approaches, and materials. But if we look at it this way, that the real master of learning can only be the learner, then we might think that in this business of teaching and learning, the learner is king, to quote a phrase that's used by a business community in Cameroon. And of course, the research in our field has shown us that factors such as the learning needs, the interest, the motivation, individual differences amongst learners account largely for how successful they become in learning a foreign language, and sometimes even more important than how successful or than good teaching per se. So isn't it time maybe for us to take a pause and think about the learner and learning? Of course, my research over the last couple of years has focused on developing learner agency and teacher agency and incorporating both in the enactment and dissemination of good practice or contextually appropriate practices. And I've done this through two main strands of my research, one which focuses on teachers reflecting on practice, and also students or children, teenagers reflecting on the practice of their teachers, and having teachers to listen to learners and develop ideas for what might be appropriate to their learners and in their context. And the other strand has been through doing the same, but through what Richard Smith and I have called teacher association research. And if you've got time, maybe you would want to check with OUP colleagues to have a link to the webinar, which I did yesterday, 2 days ago, focusing on my research, to have better insight into what I'm talking about. So let's look at an example of some of the research that I've been doing and what I found from talking to children, 11-year-old children, about the teaching, how their teachers teach them, and trying to get their own ideas about what good teaching might consist of. So the first example is from a group of 11-year-old girls in one of the classrooms where I've been doing my research. And in this excerpt, I asked the students to show me their exercise books and just for the term and tell me which lesson they think was their best lesson, the English lesson they enjoyed the best. And these children are all, as you would expect, showing me those lessons in which they scored very high marks in the practice exercise. But one of them, Lydia, shows me a lesson in which she actually had a 0 in the exercise, so she failed. And she goes, "This is my best lesson. I had a 0 in the exercise." And I ask her, "So was it your best lesson because you had a 0? And she says, "No, because the teacher did not tell us what to do. So I had a 0. But after my friend explained to me what I was supposed to do, and I know it very well now, So I asked her, but wait a minute, who helps you understand more, your friend or your teacher? And she says, I understand better when my friend explains to me. And I think this has huge implications for how we organize teaching. And I'll come to that later on. Now, the next excerpt with a group of boys in another classroom. Here we are talking about one of their teachers and how she teaches them writing, composition writing, for example. And Manga says, when she teaches us composition, sometimes we write alone, sometimes we do it in a group. Which do you prefer? I prefer it in a group because when you make a mistake, your friend can correct you. But when you are alone, you just write and make a mistake and you continue without knowing. And then Manga goes on, completes what Nelson just says, to say you can write and you put is, and you want to think again to write, you just come and put another is. But when your friend sees it, he will tell you. In fact, what they're saying is that working together ensures that you can be corrected by your mates. And now let's look at the last one, last of those quotes, those excerpts that I picked for you. Jamia, another girl, says, and here we are talking about a particular lesson that a teacher just taught, and we meet in a group to discuss that lesson, because in the research project, I also discussed those individual lessons with the teachers themselves to see what their perspectives were, and later on discussed learners' perspectives and teachers' perspectives with another group of teachers. So here, Jamia is saying the story was not interesting. This was about a story, and they're looking at a particular story. The story was not interesting. If the teacher, asked us, we would have written a better story. So I asked, but that is what is in the textbook. Now we're looking at materials. And Jamia goes, we know, but it is not interesting. And many children in our class do not have the book. We are not children. We can make it more interesting. And I asked, what do you think, others? And there was a lot of consensus in that. And Lydia goes, if you like it, give us a topic and we will write it. Very interesting, and you will like it, I swear. So this tells us that learners are capable, even these 11-year-old students are capable of having a say, not just in the practices of their teachers, but also in the materials that they are being exposed to. And I've seen this all through my career, teaching young learners and teenagers, where students go, oh, this text is boring. Why don't we talk about football? Now, but more importantly, these bring to mind some questions that we might want to reflect on. And some of these include things like, what is the importance of the teacher? Is the teacher the only important actor? Are good methods and good materials enough? And of course, I might want to say, who says they are good materials? What should a teacher's role be in the language classroom, and what should a learner's role be in the language classroom? And I guess we all have answers to these questions, and we might agree on many areas and disagree in many areas, but definitely as practitioners, we are thinking about these questions. So, I want us to explore these questions in a sense, especially the last two, by looking at my own teaching experience in some years ago when I was a secondary school teacher teaching teenagers in the far north of my country, Cameroon. I had my smallest class, by the way, was made up of 12-year-olds, and there were 147 students. And my largest class, which is the one you can see on the slide on the screen, was made up of 235 teenagers, and some of them literally standing outside in temperatures that were around 46 degrees Celsius. I've written about this in an article with Richard Smith, which was published in 2011, and it's available, freely available online. You can look at that. So in this context, I had all sorts of issues. This were my students crowded in the classroom, but also they did not have the resources, the materials. It was that difficult that in a class of 235 teenagers, we had less than 19 textbooks. and so I could not rely on the textbooks to generate teaching. And of course, that was my interactive whiteboard that I used at that time. And if you think this is bad enough for a classroom, how about this? Schools in the capital of South Sudan, Juba, where children don't even have textbooks. And my work there has been helping teachers to be able to use the environment to still teach children to read and to write. So, as a novice teacher, and as many of my colleagues have observed in Cameroon and in other parts of sub-Saharan Africa would do, we focus on those easy things, those things that are easy for us to teach, like grammar, because we can teach the rules, assess learning by giving a practice activity, which would be fairly straightforward. But the problem is that we often, in teaching grammar, in my early years, in teaching my students grammar, I taught them vocabulary items, taught them the best structures. For example, if you're writing an argumentative essay, what are the expressions you need to use? And of course, I thought everything was working well until when I asked my students to write an essay about polygamy and monogamy. And I had students saying things like, I think that monogamy is better than polygamy. However, some men marry more than one wife. Thus, they can be as happy as a king. Therefore, they should marry many wives. Nevertheless, it is good to marry one wife. Consequently, you will be happier. So I had spent time teaching them expressions that you use in argumentative essays like however, therefore, nevertheless, consequently, etc., etc. And this student, if you look at the text, every individual sentence is grammatically correct. So I think I'd done a good job in teaching grammar. But in terms of textuality, this text doesn't quite make sense because the students are struggling at sentence level because that's all they have been taught. So what happened to me then was the realization that while we spend a lot of our time teaching them the rules of grammar and vocabulary, that's not where they should be. We are not on the same page with them. Students are not interested in that because that doesn't, as we can see from the previous example, help them to achieve the communicative competence that we want them to achieve. And this picture from my research project looking at teachers' practices and also how students respond to those practices captures what I mean here. This is a classroom where the teacher is teaching irregular verbs and wants students to list irregular verbs. You can see the reaction of the students. They're all thinking really hard, and this is hard work for them. But move to the next slide. Who can tell us a short story? These are the same students. So while we are busy teaching grammar and easy to measure components of the language, students are interested in something else. They want to tell stories. Of course, in telling stories, we all know, for those of us who tell stories, that in telling stories, we use lots of irregular verbs. So it is not the knowledge of irregular verbs that the students are interested in. They're interested in using irregular verbs or in using language in ways that make sense and that excite them. They're interested in issues around their community and those things that bother them on a day-to-day basis. They're interested in their dreams, maybe dreams for a better world. These are graffiti that I took from South Sudan in front of a school. This group is called Anataban. They are young people, they are teenagers. Anataban means we are tired. We are tired of war. And you can see the things that matter to them. They're doing these graffitis around, talking about the things that really matter to them. And these are the things that matter to the students in our classroom. Those global issues, those local issues with a global resonance that can change the world because the world is their world. So, with this kind of realization, I've over the years had a change of perspective from the traditional teacher of grammar, vocabulary, and those easy things that are assessed in the exams, but looking to a teacher who looks at learning as a mutually constructed and collaborative experience between teachers and learners, working as partners on the same page, I might say. And this entails negotiating with learners in terms of how we define our goals, in terms of how we decide what we want to achieve, how we want to achieve them, and where we would find the resources to achieve what we want to achieve. And through that realization, I've been able to engage in different practices, some of which I want to share with you in this presentation. So going back to my early classroom of 235 teenagers, through a process of negotiating with students in that classroom, I came to realize that they themselves were uncomfortable in a room because their friends were standing outside. A classroom that was built initially meant to take 60 to 80 students was now accommodating 235 teenagers, some of them standing outside. And through a long process, which I will not bother you describing here, we agreed that we would run some activities out of the class in groups under the trees, and that students would themselves go out there and look for materials in English. So each student had the responsibility to go out, because they didn't have textbooks, find whatever material they could find in English, come and see me, discuss that with me, tell me, suggest what they thought we could learn from that material and from the materials. And all I did was look at the curriculum and see what aspects within the curriculum could be explored through the text. And then we also negotiated how we would explore the text in the classroom or whatever material they brought. And there were lots of creative ideas coming from students. Of course, the credit was that each of these would be presented to the rest of the class as having been donated by a particular student, and that made them somehow a hero for a particular lesson. And it was more of a competition, with students going out, finding materials, thinking of creative ways in which we could use the resources to learn English, having lots of suggestions, and then competing to be amongst those whose lessons would be taken, would be brought to the classroom. So, one of those materials that we explored, which a student brought to me, was Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream. And this is what she presented to me. And after negotiating over and over, we agreed that I would type out the text. I typed the text out and produced as many copies for all students. And then we agreed that we would discuss this in class. So the text that I'm going to show you after this one are a result of the discussions that we held in class in plenary. And then they now decided to get into their groups to identify specific issues within their immediate environment, within the country or around the world, that mattered to them, and to, in groups, write a dream poem that showed their vision in relation to that particular issue. So an example of a group that worked on issues of tribalism, that's a really big issue in Cameroon, wrote the following poem, following Martin Luther King's model, the one presented. Of course, Martin Luther King Jr. wrote a speech, not a poem, but the text that was brought to us was presented in the form of a poem. And this is what the students say. I have a dream that one day tribalism will be kicked out of Cameroon, and soon Gadamayos and Wajos, I would explain what that means, will live together and think together about the future of their nation. I have a dream that one day Bamilekes and Mundans will eat Nkui and Nyebe together. I have a dream that one day Cameroon will be a big village where every son and daughter will feel good everywhere. This will be a day of glory. Now, we are in the north of Cameroon, and social prejudices in the country have developed words. People have developed words that sometimes are pejorative. And in this group, we had students from all over the country, some of them from the northern part of the country and some from the southern parts of the country. Now, in the north of Cameroon, which is mostly predominantly Muslim, those of us who come from the south are referred to as Gadamayos, which means people on the other side of the Mayo, which is the river Benue. And it's a pejorative way of saying we are not religious. And the people in the south call northerners Wajos, a pejorative word which actually means cattle rearers. And this is a group made up of Gadamayos and Wajos, dreaming that those prejudices would disappear and that Gadamayos and Wajos would be together. Now, there is a tribe in the south called the Bamileke tribe, and their main meal, their main food is called Nkui. And in the north, there's a tribe called the Mundang tribe, and their main meal is Nyebe. And in the group, we have Mundangs and Bamilekes, and this is how together they're seeing themselves as a family and dreaming of a future where their tribal attachments will not be the major cause of discrimination. The next one issue was on gender discrimination, and this group wrote their own poem, which I would not read to you just because of time, but you can, hopefully this will be recorded and shared so you can all see it. But this is about gender discrimination, because this is a group of teenagers who are concerned about issues of gender discrimination, not just about grammar and vocabulary. They want to use language to talk about those things that matter to them, rather than listen to the teacher teaching them about the structures of an argumentative essay in the way in which I did it. So, these two examples lead me to the next thing, a story. Now, another student came to me with a short story, which was taken from, which she had cut out from a manual that was developed by the American Peace Corps volunteers in Cameroon. And this was a very short story about an issue which in the North was quite sensitive because it's got to do with sexuality, HIV/AIDS. And although that appears in textbooks, and of course, I don't know how that happens in your context, but in my context, this appears in textbooks for even 12-year-olds. The reason is because in the early 90s, HIV prevalence was enormous in Cameroon, and it was important that we start talking about sexuality more openly to children so that they understand the dangers, because most of the communities are very traditional, and so sexuality is such a taboo. And this student brings this story about Habiba, who had her first boyfriend at the age of 12. His name was Aminu. They were together for 2 years. They had sex. When she was 14, Habiba began going out with another boy called Irumsia. Soon after she started dating Irumsia, she got pregnant. She left school because it was illegal for pregnant women to go to school. During her pregnancy, Habiba had some medical problems and went to see the traditional doctor in her village. Because she was complaining of pain in her lower back, he cut her back with a razor blade. She felt better after that. And before she was 15, Habiba had her first baby. Habiba returned to school when she was 16. She fell in love with Mabudi and stayed with him until she finished school. When Habiba was 20, they got married. After they got married, Habiba had her second baby. When Habiba was 22, she got sick. She had diarrhea for several months and lost a lot of weight. She also had a persistent fever and a cough. A few years later, Habiba died. Such a short story. But through negotiation with the student, we decided that each group was going to produce something creative from the text and something that was linked to the grammar items that we had already learned. And the students in this group decided to look at direct and indirect speech. I guess that's something you teach in your classrooms, direct and indirect speech with teenagers or very young people. And what I have here is an example of what one group decided to do. So they transformed these into comic strips in which they brought the characters to life, communicating with each other and talking to themselves, but also revealing the story exactly as it is. So in this first page, for example, you can see the English version, Habiba's short story. And they're saying, I think that's Habiba. Good morning, Amina. How are you? What's the program for the weekend? And he goes, morning, Habiba. I'm fine, thank you. Habiba, how about, you asked about the program for the weekend. What would you say if I passed through your home this evening? And so the story continues. As you can see, it goes from one thing to the other, and they're back. They're all now in his bedroom, and they're making love, which is something really strange to see young teenagers producing. But so the sequence of the story goes up to the end. I don't want to bore you with reading through the very long script, but you can see here that she's pregnant. That's Abiba is now pregnant, and you can see somewhere here she's already gone to see the native doctor who treats her, but then later on she falls sick, she can't come to school, and that's the end of the story. So she got married, you can see their wedding images, and that's the church there somehow, and she has a baby boy. You can see her husband here carrying the baby, and then something happens, she dies, and the story ends with the picture of a grave. But what's interesting here is more the text, which unfortunately I can't share with you except on the slides. The text shows that they are engaging with the story in creative ways and creating these dialogues, which, when you sum up, actually tell you the story in a different way. And they're using the grammar and vocabulary that we are so desperate to teach them in a more creative way that makes sense to them, but also resonates with the story that they are genuinely interested in. And another group which decided not to do comic strips decided that they would write a poem. Another group decided to write a completely different story about Nafisatu. So the story goes like this. Once upon a time, there was a girl called Nafisatu who loved too much money. She was a girlfriend of Roderick, who studied in the University of Yaoundé 1. But Roderick didn't give much money to Nafisatu because he was still a student. Sometimes Nafisatu had adventure with another man, and who can give her much money. She didn't think to the consequences of these acts. One night, when she was going back to her house, she saw a handsome and rich man who called Mr. Winston. She said, "This can be a kind of man that I love." He was in health, and he proposed to Nafisatu to accompany her to her house with his car. During the journey, he told her that they can go to his house. She accepted, but on the road she was thinking about her poor boyfriend Roderick. They stayed all the night together, and they had half sexual contact, but Nafisatu forgot to use a condom. After 3 months, she became sick with Roderick. One day, one of their best friends told Nafisatu and Roderick to make the HIV test. They made it, and it was positive. The lessons that we can get from this story is that we cannot know with physical aspects the person who has AIDS, and that money is a way to contact AIDS. Now, this is a completely different story that is inspired by the previous one, but this, of course, has a different twist, and it's looking at issues that actually happen within their society, and things like young girls who are being carried away by the wealth of people, things like the use of condoms for protection and things like that. These would be issues that are not discussed in the textbook, and that sometimes as adults in a very conservative, traditional context, we might feel embarrassed to discuss with students. But here, these are teenagers who are saying, no, we want to talk about those things that matter to us. And we want to learn not just the language, but use the language to educate ourselves about things that are happening in our environment and which are affecting our lives. Now, I'll leave the experience from my previous school to share an experience from one of my colleagues, and this has emerged from the Teacher Association research project, which I've been running with Richard Smith in Cameroon. Now, the CAMELTA, which is the Cameroon English Language Teachers Association research group, is made up of 34 early career professionals within the first 5 to 10 years. 5 to 10 years of their career. And the group was a consequence of a larger research project within the association itself. In 2013, we asked teachers at a conference to think about research questions that are important to them. So if they had the opportunity to do research, what will be their top 10 research questions? And each teacher wrote each teacher wrote down between 1 and 3 research questions, which we collated and categorized and then uploaded onto the CAMELTA webpage. Now, this group of teachers identified from this CAMELTA research group identified from this bank of research questions some questions that resonated with their own experience, and they decided to come together to investigate these research questions through different ways. So they have face-to-face meetings, they have article discussions on WhatsApp, and they read the articles and then they discuss via WhatsApp. They have they teach and they observe. Sometimes they just meet to tell stories of a lesson that they taught and how successful it was. So for the last year, they've been looking at things like motivation. That has been their theme. And they've been exploring research questions from the bank that have to do with motivation, and developing action and collaborative action research projects together in pairs within the group, reporting back. But also these teachers are beginning to speak at regional conferences already, and also some of them are already publishing out of the country, writing about the experiences that they get from their group. So it's kind of empowering for them to be able to be the next big speakers at CAMELTA conferences, and to be the people who can write about their experiences and who can justify their practices to policymakers based on informed research that has been done in their own classroom, on evidence from research. So one of the things that they've been doing recently is the mobility project scheme, which basically involves 2 teachers pairing up, traveling to each other's classroom, observing what they are doing in different parts of the region, because they're based in one region, and also working with their students. So their students know that they are doing research and trying to improve their practice, and the students are part of the project because the students proposed, they started with a questionnaire and on motivation, and the students suggested things that that would motivate them. And one of those things that emerged from the students was that they wanted to be learning English and to use it to talk about things in their environment. And so one of the topics that I'm sharing with you is this one, which was proposed by the students in the 2 classrooms. And they said they want to talk about environmental protection because the city is very messy and they think something can be done. So the project involved students deciding that what they wanted to do was to talk about recycling waste within the city as one way of curbing pollution. And so in both classrooms, independently, the children in the 2 classrooms worked on this project together. The developed, you can see these pictures show some of the things that they produced as evidence of how some of the waste can be put into good use. But then that was accompanied by a project to write a letter to their local councillors or to the mayor, proposing ways in which the mayor could ensure that the environment is kept cleaner. And because they already had worked on this, they had produced their own materials and resources, they were using this as examples of how the council could better manage waste in the community. So these are some of the letters that they wrote in their groups. I'll share just 2 examples, and hopefully you can refer to this presentation much later to read the letters that the students themselves wrote. So that's another group writing a letter to the mayor. I'll spare you reading the long text. What I want us to do now is to come back to Lydia. Remember Lydia at the beginning of this presentation. I talked about this student who said, my best lesson was the one in which I scored a 0. And together I also shared the one in which Lydia and her friends, Jamia, said if the teacher asked us to write that story, we would have written a better story because the one in the textbook is boring. And this is what they do. They did. So after my research project, I had a week working with them, and I asked them to look at a story that was in the book, and we worked through a process which I would share. That would be what I'll be doing in my workshop, through a process, a variety of steps. They were able to produce a text that was far more cognitively engaging than the original text, and they were able to set for themselves reading comprehension questions that were cognitively higher than those that were in the textbook. And they were also able to use the text itself to draw pictures that were then used in another classroom as a basis for developing a different kind of text. So for those of you who would be in the workshop, you would probably have an opportunity to see the story I'm talking about. It's a story from Christine Nuttall's book, 2006 book, that was used in one of the textbooks in Cameroon. So what I want to share is one of the pictures. We saw how the teenagers transformed a story into comic strips. With these young 11-year-olds, what I did was that they looked at the story and each of them drew a picture of the story, of something in the story that captivated them. So here, for example, from the story, this particular student is interested in the hospital scene where this woman who's had an accident is being treated by the medical doctor. And then this picture was taken to another classroom and of 11-year-olds. We did not tell them what the story that led to this picture. We simply gave them the picture and said, okay, you say you can write your own stories and text. Look at this picture, which was designed by your friends in the other class, and we want you to think about a text that you think would capture this picture. Some of them wrote stories, but some of them wrote factual text, and I'll share one of the factual texts with you. The title for this group is The Importance of a Hospital. And they say the most important thing in our life is to have in good health. These are 11-year-olds from French-speaking homes in an English medium school. When you are sicking, you must go to hospital. In hospital, a doctor can look at your blood and your eyes and your mouth, and he can discover the cause that is making you to be sick. When he discovers, he will prescribe some tablets or injections which can make you to become well again. It is very good to go and consult in the hospital when you are sick. Many people taking medicine at home or buy from the road, which is dangerous and can kill them. Right, now, this again is a burning issue in the community, auto-medication, and we have all these hawkers who get expired drugs and sell them cheap by the roadside. And the children here know that that's something that's happening in their community, and they're aware of the dangers of that. And here you can see them trying to use language to express an idea, to talk about a theme that is very important within their community, that's engaging to them within their community. Now, the examples that I've shown so far, if you notice that there's a lot in this text that can help the teacher identify exactly what language issues the learners have. And that is quite important, because what that means is that we can then identify these issues and address them in a way that is relevant to them. And I will comment on that in a short while. I want to conclude the list of examples that I've presented to you by looking at this excerpt which one of my students brought to me. So I am walking down, and I'm back to my teenagers. I'm walking down the school campus, going to the staff room, and this young woman runs up to me. Please, sir, I can also do it. I said, really? Okay. What can you do? I have wrote a song. No, what have you written? Oh, okay, I have written a song. And I look at the text. It's really good. This is just an excerpt, but I don't know what it's all about. Okay, so what's the song about? Can you sing it to me? Can anyone guess? If you can't, don't worry. Maybe the next slide tells you what she has done. So what she's done is listen to Michael Jackson's Heal the World and has written her own song that reflects something within the school. Remember, I said in Cameroon, French and English are official languages, and the government promotes bilingualism as a factor of national unity. Politicians believe that if every Cameroonian can speak in French and in English, we would be a united country, although that's proving very difficult now. And so looking at these languages are often seen within the spectrum of bilingualism in Cameroon. So what she's done is looking at the importance for her as a francophone in learning English and trying to encourage others to be more positive in English. And this is how the song goes. Come today, join our English class in order to be bilingual in the future. There is only one way, just to be a good Cameroonian. Make a better choice and join us today. Right. So, for me, looking at these materials, the materials that I've presented to you have not just been materials that were produced by learners, but they've also been materials that we have now used, and myself and my other colleagues are now using to teach other learners in Cameroon, because this is a very resource-poor context. In fact, UNESCO statistics for 2016, in August 2016, showed that in Cameroon there are up to 12 students per textbook in a classroom. We are actually one of the lowest resourced in sub-Saharan Africa in terms of number of textbooks per learner. So in a context where there are no resources, where students can be very good agents in terms of the production or the identification of useful, authentic resources, using learners' materials really helps us take into account or develop their agency. When learners know that they can bring materials to the classroom, to the teacher, and they can explore those materials in ways that make sense and that help them learn a lesson, it helps develop their self-image and their sense of agency. And that's quite important. But more importantly for me is that it brings authenticity to the learning experience. We are talking about things that are authentic to their experience, things that are relevant to them, not just things that the textbook wants us to teach them. And it also provides opportunities for more learner collaboration because they are developing these materials together in a collaborative manner, sometimes relying on support from the teacher, sometimes in ways that are completely independent of the teacher. And this helps in a sense, enhances negotiation of meaning and motivates learner. And for me as a teacher, it provides a kind of a diagnostics for accuracy therapy. So I can identify exactly where there are language issues. And when you address some of these language issues, grammatical structures or vocabulary use in relation to a text that they have produced, it makes more sense to them because they can relate that directly to something that they have produced rather than just learning grammar and vocabulary for the sake of doing a practice exercise or answering grammar and vocabulary questions in a test. So, for me, making teaching relevant involves looking at learners not just as participants in the process, but as active partners in the learning process. And also realizing that learners have a variety of talents. Some of them are musicians, songwriters, as we've seen. Some of them can produce fantastic comic strips. Some of them can draw wonderful images and pictures and talk about them in creative ways. Some of them can write beautiful stories, interesting or very didactic educative text, and we need to be exploring those different talents. Learners are resources, and they are resource providers, and we need to rely on them. And to achieve that, probably one of the things that I've done is to encourage learners to seek answers to questions such as, who am I? What do I want to achieve in learning the language? How do I achieve what I really want to achieve? What are the challenges involved? How do I overcome these challenges? How much support do I need? From whom do I need support? Do I need support from my classmates? Do I need support from the teacher? And things like that, because this helps to build their sense of autonomy and their sense of agency. I've also, just to pull my thoughts together, and this is my last slide, I promise, the thing that I've learned from this experience of working with these young people, these 11-year-olds and also teenagers, resonates very much with what Michael West said in the late 60s, that a language is learned rather than taught, and too much teaching can be an obstacle to language learning. So, in a sense, a good part of our job is to help students to learn a language, not to teach them the language. And we can only help them to learn the language if we are engaging with them in those things that make sense to them, rather than just teaching them aspects of the language that are easy to measure because the curriculum or the assessment process in the country doesn't permit us to explore areas which are not measured. I think it's quite important that students get involved not just in the process of learning, in the process of producing those materials that are then used for teaching and learning. And for me, this realization is useful in helping teachers to see learners as partners, working together with them on the same page. Thank you very much.